Okay.
Okay.
So off we go.
All right.
I wanted to ask you first about your time in Berkeley. This was before you came to New York, before you met Abby.
Right.
What what? How could you compare what was going on there with what was happening a little bit later? Give me a sense of what the protest movement was like there. We're talking about what, 64, 65?
It was prettier and mellower than New York because the sun shined a lot, and there were lots of great flowers and fruit trees growing in the streets. So that creates kind of one mood, like we had the term flower children. I never thought of hippies on the Lower East Side as flower children. They were more like weeds. They're growing out of the sidewalk. So there was a difference in tone, a kind of we were mellower, smiled more. Not that there was a difference in radicalism. Berkeley radicals, was sort of at one time defining the term of what a radical was, but it was a sort of a kind of a mellower, more laid back kind of radicalism than the moods I encountered when I returned to New York in '67 and met Abby Hoffman, and things were just a little rougher edged, a little harsher, a little angrier. And that's New York. It's New York City. I mean, there's a difference between New York City and San Francisco and Berkeley. And the radicals reflected the local cultures, just like everybody else did.
You don't just wake up one day, or maybe you do just wake up one day and decide to be a radical. What was the evolutionary step for you to all of a sudden, did you just wake up one day and people called you a radical, or the?
Well, I mean, the evolutionary steps go back maybe even into the late '50s when I started, just reading books, and I happened upon at some used bookstore on Fourth Avenue in Manhattan, some books on socialism by Upton Sinclair and H.G. Wells. And I remember sort of finding, these are interesting ideas, and maybe so. But I never thought of like being an activist or anything. But I was sort of getting ideas into my head, you might say, and I think the thing I also kind of almost as a lark went to Cuba in 1960 when it was still actually legal to go. There was still travel. I went Cubana, Air Cubana from LaGuardia, and that was an impressive experience for me. But I still, it was interesting. It was like an adventure, but it didn't become like that would be my life, to be a radical. The thing that did it was when I was traveling around the country and I discovered Berkeley in 1965. And that scene sold itself. It was so attractive, so exciting. There was such intellectual, cultural diversity in the air. It was so fun-loving. And as I say, the sunshine, and frankly, the women were very attractive. And it's being radical sold itself. It was just, how could I not be? This is fantastic. These guys, it's such an adventurous and interesting life.
But isn't there a tentative step when you're going from someone who's been reading about socialism, who maybe starts to identify with being a socialist and wants to make change, and then suddenly organizing a protest against the war?
Oh yeah.
What are the kind of baby steps that you took, or were people suddenly saying, hey, now are you an organizer? So I'm looking to you for guidance, or
no, Not at first. I was just, I was just another, looked like, I started growing my hair long, just another blonde hippie in California, big deal. But I was having a great time. Then the Vietnam Day Committee, which was the peace group, the path-breaking, actually, peace group, that Jerry Rubin was very important to, had a table they set up every day on the campus. And the person doing the table left and became available. And it was a big crisis because someone has to set up the table. It doesn't just happen automatically. You got to go there, set up the table, sit at it, give out pamphlets, sell booklets, so forth. And so I said, well, who's going to do it? I was sitting there, I raised my hand, I said, well, I'll do it. So I said, okay, so I did. And so I was sitting behind the Vietnam Day Committee table. Well, people would come up and they want to argue, say, soldiers or pro-war students. So they would come up and want to argue with you about the war. And so I would debate with them. A crowd would gather around. It was kind of fun. I did well. I had a good New Yorker's sense of combat, and I was informed. I would call that reading, so it came in handy. So I started developing a reputation, for being a smart guy who could kind of take charge of a situation. Then at one point, again, there was a noon rally scheduled. One of the speakers dropped out last minute. So someone said, Stu, why don't you just get up there and give a little speech? People know you from the table. Well, I did, and it went over very well. And so there I was.
Wait a minute, you're like Stu from the table.
Yeah.
Okay, and now all of a sudden
Stu on the steps of Sproul Hall giving speech, see? Well, reporters come over to me, and I start reading in the paper the next day, Stu Alvin, Vietnam Day Committee leader. Leader? I've just been in town for a few months. But that's how it happens. The media started referring to me as a leader. So when people say, well, he must be a leader. So that's how it happened. And along the way, I met and became, although our relationship got off to a somewhat bumpy start, but we became extremely good friends. This is Jerry Rubin. And Jerry had been a significant figure in starting the Vietnam Day Committee. So the fact that he saw me as having this leadership potential certainly didn't hurt.
I know you were protesting probably a number of different things, but at the time, what were your positions? What were the kinds of things that you felt? Did you feel like you were leading a revolution in the United States? Were you focused on one particular issue?
Well, it took a while for this to shape up in my head. The war was certainly central to everything. Everything began and ended with the war. And then later, the United Farm Workers were also a cause, and the Black Panther Party, because they were in Oakland, they were nearby, so they became a cause. In terms of the idea of revolution, let's say in 65, 66, I was listening to people talk about revolution. I was considering the ideas, but I hadn't come to any kind of conclusions on it. I mean, I definitely wanted to see the social system as a whole change, but I really wasn't sure quite how you would go about that or how you could do. I knew that opposing the war was a good thing, and a few other causes, but I wasn't quite sure at that point. I didn't have a sense of saying, well, I'm a revolutionary, because I wasn't sure what that would mean. Later, I developed that.
When you said you knew you wanted to see the system change.
Yeah.
Why? What was it about the system that you felt? I know these are very basic questions, but I'm just...
Well, the ongoing, to this day, tendency for the American system to choose war. I mean, occasionally people choose it for America. America gets attacked and so forth. But on the whole, most wars we seem to choose to go into. Iraq being one of them, and Vietnam was another one, Korea. And, so there's this tendency of the system to live through and survive through waging war. And the technology and the militarism, finances, subsidizes the economy, kind of keeps it afloat. And I just thought, even in '65, that there was a better way to do things, that you didn't need military technology to keep the economy afloat. There could be other ways to do it. And also that a lot of these wars could not happen. The U.S. could take a friendlier attitude toward political diversity. Okay, the communists in Asia, why can't we work with communists in Asia? Why are we just against communists? And today it's like, well, there are all kinds of Islamic fundamentalists. Aren't there some we can work with, for God's sakes? Why do we always just sort of simply have to go to war with Islam? And so there is this tendency in the system. And then also, I couldn't help but notice that since World War II, every war the U.S. got into was against the third world people. Can't miss that. It's not like we're fighting Scandinavians. So I wanted to change that, and that was pretty fundamental. But I just wouldn't have called it revolutionary. I would say, well, maybe elect somebody who could do that or something. In '65 and '66.
Were you and Jerry seen as leaders, and were you very strident? What were the kinds of tactics that you were, or were you very sober about some of these things?
Jerry was certainly considered a leader, definitely. And I was sort of an up-and-coming leader, but Jerry was an established leader. And when Jerry got subpoenaed to the House On-American Activities Committee, I think in '66, '67, and he decided he was going to wear a costume, American Revolutionary War uniform. It's going to appear before the House On-American Activities Committee. Well, no one had ever done anything like that. Everybody got very serious when they were called before UAC and read statements that were, very harsh and angry, and then they were usually kicked out or busted for contempt or something. Well, Jerry says, no, I'm going to have some fun with this. And I remember we went around to the costume shops in Berkeley and Oakland trying to rent a costume for him. And he and I did that. And then we got a costume and we wrote this statement, and he would give it out. See, he'd give it out to the press, show up there in his costume, and then appear before the committee. And the committee, of course, wouldn't let him testify. So he started screaming, I have a right to testify. And he was actually the first guy to be thrown out of that room for wanting to testify. And UAC was never the same after that.
Well, it was different from the McCarthy era and that era. This is
right. Nobody did that. See, this was serving notice that people weren't scared anymore. and that people would have some fun with them, would joke at UAC. And
That's a shift. That's a shift where suddenly, maybe because you were younger,
Younger.
and didn't have the same kind of relationship with them, and you so much history had gone under the bridge with UAC that you were not laughing at them, but saw them for maybe having Peter. I don't know, putting words in their mouth.
well, yeah, I mean, it was like they seem to be like another generation. It's kind of like it's like being afraid of your parents. You know, saying we're not, you know, we don't need no stinking UAC, you know, and so this is also, of course, established Jerry even in the national media, not just the Bay Area press, and so he was on his way to becoming a real national leader as a result of that.
Was he a leader in the sense of what we think of as someone who's organizing people and organizing demonstrations, or was it more of a leader? I mean, was it really that clear cut? Was he more someone who would show up and make a speech, or?
In the mid '60s in Berkeley, he really did organize events. Got on the telephone, got people to show up, organized meetings. Meetings led to people taking responsibilities and making sure that protest events took place. Organized a teach-in, an anti-war teach-in, things like that. Yeah, no, Jerry at this period he's not much of a public speaker. He's a more behind-the-scenes guy. Not particularly colorful in those days, and I think I probably did a little more public speaking than him at that period. Later, after he meets Abby, there's a transition, and he becomes more of a performer leader, more like Abby. He still tries to do some organizing, but it's never quite the same thing. He's more like just someone who shows up and gives a speech, performs, is funny, writes books, Do It, especially very influential book. And of course he's at the demonstrations. He's taken the knocks, gets indicted in Chicago, dangerous stuff. But he's not a leader in the traditional sense anymore.
All right. So, when's the first time did you ever hear about Abbie Hoffman before you met him? Was there?
Well, there was. I heard something. I remember I was reading in the Village Voice that Abbie had been something about how this former white civil rights worker had gotten in a big feud with some blacksmith organizers over something that he said and wrote a letter to the Voice or something like that. So there was something sort of simmering about, but it didn't make much of an impression on me. I met Abbie for the first time right outside the New York Stock Exchange in '67. I was introduced to him by Jerry Rubin. Jerry had left Berkeley to work with the national mobilization for the Pentagon demonstration set for October 23rd in Washington, D.C. And I came about a week later, and we were both on the staff of the national mobilization. And Jerry had met Abbie and a circle of friends around him. In those days, they called themselves diggers, and was very taken with them and their politics. Now we, in Berkeley, Jerry and I were talking about the need to develop a more theatrical, entertaining politics to attract young people, and something like what he did at UAC. And so then he meets these guys, and they're thinking and acting in the same way, And it was so a natural relationship.
How do they meet? They're just walking down the street, or you're activists coming from a slightly different political perspective. Maybe you're coming from Berkeley. You just arrived back in New York, but Jerry's back in New York. Abby's on the Lower East Side doing Liberty House. How do those two worlds come together?
Well, Jerry, I know, was friends with Paul Krausner, who was a frequent visitor to Berkeley. He lived in New York in those days, but he would come out to Berkeley and speak a lot. So we all knew Paul. And I would think that probably when Jerry got to New York, he looked up Paul. Paul was very good friends with Abby. I think probably Paul introduced them. Paul would have been a very logical person because he was friends with Jerry, he was friends with me, and but this was his New York scene. He was very good friends with Abby. So I think probably Paul did, but then Jerry introduced me to Abby, and it was right just before we went up on the balcony of the stock exchange and threw money.
Take me through that day. It's just a normal day. Is it something that has been really planned all that well, or is it something that just is a spur of the moment imagination? Why were you there?
Well, the way I found out about it, I was flying in from the Bay Area to work with Jerry on the Pentagon demonstration. And I came up to his apartment on the Lower East Side on St. Mark's Place. And I was very tired, red eye special bargain rate thing, you know. And I was very tired and I wanted to sleep. And Abby says, "Hey, Abby, Jerry says you can't sleep. We're gonna throw money at the stock exchange. You have to come with me. You gotta come with me. You gotta do this." And besides, I want to introduce you to this great guy, Abby Hoffman. I couldn't believe it, but it sounded like a Fellini movie or something, you know. But so okay, so we walk over to the stock exchange, and there's Abby. He's bright. He's all over the place. He's super energetic. He's obviously a charismatic, good-humored guy. And so Jerry introduces us. And Abby was very taken with Jerry because of what Jerry did at UAC. He even mentioned it then again. So, you know, that was his thing that he was really impressed with. And now, what I found out is that the way they organized the stock exchange event was Abby went on the Bob Fast radio show in New York, all-night show, and promoted it. That was it.
That's how it came about.
Yeah.
Some idea that. Yeah. Was there what was the political reason for it? What was the sort of philosophical?
Well, the idea was to satirize greed. Well, where could you do that best but on Wall Street? And then if you could get the stockbrokers to cooperate with you in your radical theater, well, then you really had it made. And so when we did cooperate, because when we threw them the money, they all came running for it. We stopped trading on the floor of the exchange. It was incredible. And these guys are piling up on each other. These millionaire stockbrokers reaching for these dollar bills that are floating down from the balcony. Well, that was really great.
How many of the, I mean, you just take cab, you show up, Abby's there, is he making a speech before
Mostly.
you go?
I don't think he was making a speech.
But you're hippie, you've got long hair.
Yeah, very long hair, yeah.
and you're marching in there? Or?
Yeah, well, they didn't want to let us in. They knew, they'd been tipped. And so the private cops of the stock exchange didn't want to let us in. And I remember, and this really impressed me about Abby. So I figured, this is sunk. It doesn't work if we don't get on the balcony. They're not going to let us on the balcony. It's over. And then Abby says to the guard, the only reason you're not letting us in is because we're Jewish. My guy goes, oh, his head is spinning, and he says, oh, he didn't know what to do. And everybody starts saying, he's anti-Semitic, that's what it is. So then he said, okay, you can go on there for a few minutes. And that's how we got on. Well, needless to say, I was very impressed with Abby. Boy, did he think on his feet. You know? So that was my.
So you're up there.
Yeah, we're up there. Yeah.
And then, are they looking at you? Are they paying attention to you downstairs?
It takes a moment or two, but then they get wind that we are up there.
Are you shouting? Are you saying it?
No, not really. Yeah, they couldn't hear you anyway.
And how many of you were there?
At least 10. I'm not
10 guys.
No, some women. Some mixed group, yeah.
So you're up there, and then what happened?
Oh, we started throwing money. And that really got their attention. They started throwing money. Someone, I guess Abby was one of them, they passed the hat and collected some money, and we started throwing it over the balcony. Well, then the brokers started running for the money. The trading ceases, and
are you saying
we've seized the moment. No, you see, that was the thing with this style of politics. That it started playing down leaflets and speeches. The theatrical act itself was your statement. In other words, Charlie Chaplin's satires, silent movie satires of the rich and the powerful, were self-evident. They didn't even speak in silent movies, and it's kind of like that. The visuals of what we did spoke for itself. And
did you get thrown out?
Yeah. Actually, what happened was we ran out of paper money. They started throwing change. The stockbrokers didn't like that and started booing. Then the cops came out and cleared the balcony. But we had our day, and then we went down to the sidewalk outside the stock exchange, and Jerry and Abby and I and some other people burned money, which did get in the newspapers. You will see pictures of that. And I remember one guy, who was a typical New Yorker, he sort of said, look, if you want to get rid of money, why give it to stockbrokers? Give it to me. I need it. I mean, the guy's always stuck out. This great theatrical event. But then there's this very practical New York voice. So I always include him in the story.
Did you see? Now, where did Abby go after you burned the money? Did he split or?
Yeah, oh sure. Yeah, he probably went back to his apartment. Anita wasn't there, so he probably went to see Anita. Yeah, she was doing. Tell her nobody was arrested. Okay. Yeah, and then I went back to Joey's apartment. And actually slept.
What was the response?
Tremendous newspaper coverage. I remember that. All over the world. What amazed me about it was organized with a minimal amount of effort, a minimal amount of expense, and it got worldwide coverage. And it really did seem to be a way to go. It wasn't easy for us to get media coverage in those days. I mean, it still isn't, but in those days, newspapers could simply not assign reporters to cover stories, period. You have a demonstration of a couple of thousand people, say in Sproul Hall Plaza in Berkeley. There isn't a word in the paper. They just decide not to cover it. So we were always battling. This was one of the things that would be about Yippee. Yippee was like hypnotic on editors and people who made assignments. Ordinarily, they might not give space to radicals, but the theater was so good and provided such good visuals that they said, well, we don't like these guys, but they give us some good TV. So that was one of the things Yippee had going for it. It could actually get covered. And it wasn't, it really, the major thing was, we used to think, well, we're right, and we're even turning out big demonstrations. We're not getting any press coverage.
That was a big part of it. Are we ready? Would you say, in what way did that, I won't say it's not a demonstration or whatever it was, did that make Abby's reputation, what was the effect on him?
Well, in those days, it made his reputation within countercultural radical circles. But Abbey still, he didn't give his real name to the press. He still sort of was operating under this thing of anonymity, to both be a public figure, but to not be quite known. But of course they all knew who he was too, so it was strange. But he would give his name as Abby Digger, Abby Free in those days. So the name Abby Hoffman didn't quite become established from it, no.
What was he doing on the Lower East Side at around this time? And right after that, what kind of life did he lead? What did he do when he got up in the morning?
Well, he lived on a apartment. I think it was like a ground floor apartment with Anita on St. Mark's Place too. He was an organizer, like the Free Store, and also I remember they had events at the St. Mark's Church, free food events where somehow they could get fish for free, and they would serve fish and have these events there, and of course there was the Con Ed demonstration. There were protest demonstrations, and Abby was working on a book which would be called Revolution for the Hell of It. So he's working on this book. And then it was also, you can't say this, this isn't HBO, so you can't say this, but the city of New York, shows you the Lindsay administration period, how different things were, actually gave Abby some money to write a survival guide for hippies on the Lower East Side. And the pamphlet was called, and it was published by this name, Fuck the System. Now, can you imagine? I mean, I'm not making that up. That's what it was called. And
what was that about? What did he mean by it?
Well, it was a way of living outside the system. How you could live very low rent, how you could find a lot of free food available if you knew how to do it. And there are all kinds of things. I mean, he developed this much further later when they wrote Steal This Book. But this was the beginning of Steal This Book. It was ways of surviving, of getting bread for free, of knowing when to go to restaurants when the waiters might give you some free food.
Did he live that life? In what way did he live that life that he wrote about?
Well, he certainly, the stuff he wrote about, he always liked to check out. So he may have gotten it as a tip from somebody, but he would go check it. He wouldn't write about things that they hadn't checked. And yeah, I mean, I can remember, like, we knew when to go to Ratner's when the waiters would give us lots of free rolls and jelly, like a certain time, and they were getting rid of them, you see, because they kind of late in the evening. You go at a certain time to a lot of these restaurants, and they're going to throw stuff out anyway, at least in those days, so you could get food for free. So Abby picked up on a lot of that stuff, and so he did this pamphlet, and which I guess you'll call bleak the system or something. And he and Anita were also young lovers, you know. So, yeah. And Anita was very sympathetic with Abby's views, but she wasn't, by personality, sort of liking to be too public, and she wasn't sort of an activist. She was more supportive than an activist, sympathetic, supportive. Later, she became more of an activist. So they had a kind of romantic life. They got married in a hippie ceremony in Central Park. Of course, Abby, there were a number of radio hosts, like on WBAI and Alex Bennett over at one of the commercial stations. And Abby would do a lot of radio in those days.
So was he developing some kind of cult of personality, or was he doing these actions to get to get media attention for something that he strongly believed in, or?
Well, a little bit of both were going on. I think he certainly strongly believed in this and opposed the war. I mean, they were also preparing, like, for the Pentagon demonstration. It's still called the Diggers. They were going to exorcise and levitate the Pentagon. So they added the humorous theatrical note to the demonstration, the big demonstration. And so he was getting together people, organizing them, getting together people who would show up and do entertaining things at the event. I remember they got the Fugs involved in the early punk rock group, and others who would come, artists participating.
So you said you moved to New York to work on the mobilization for that protest.
Right, exactly.
So you're there with Jerry Rubin.
Right.
And then you meet up with Abby and do the stock exchange thing, and now you're planning to have this demonstration at the Pentagon.
Right.
But there must be many people there who are going for serious political discourse.
Oh, yeah.
Is Abby sort of like a showboater to that, or is he?
Well, initially, a lot of people, especially like the older left, had problems with this new style of politics. There was particularly a thing, an issue developed, where a fellow named Keith Lamptey, one of this new crowd, suggested that we organize, he called it a looter, have people just on one day gather and go around department stores looting. I guess you might say anti-private property is that. And he listed, he wrote a very funny article about it. I don't think Keith was entirely serious. It was a good spoof piece. I was at the time the editor of the National Mobilization's little magazine, newsletter, called The Mobilizer. So he brings this article in, and I title it on Making a Perfect Mess. And I put it in the Mobilizer. Well, when it comes out, all the old leftists in the Mo, the serious people, just blow up at the appearance of this article. Oh, they say, I'm a union official for the department store workers union. How can I urge them to support this demonstration if you have an article in the Mobilizer saying you have a looted? And so it was all, they all took it seriously. There was no sense of Marx Brothers tongue-in-cheek there. They took it totally seriously. And I found it extremely amusing that they didn't get the sense of put on, that they could be put on as easily as a stockbroker.
Did Abby ever talk about what their previous life before?
Occasionally over a joint.
The fact that he had kids and his family.
No, he didn't talk about that very much. Not in those days. Later, some of his kids came around, and his sister came around, and I kind of got to know a little bit, his brother, Jack, I got to know more about his family. But in those days, no, he didn't very much, no. And he was generally thought of by the, sort of an answer to what you were saying. Yeah, there were problems between the new cultural rebels and the old left. There were tensions, there were problems. I think the Chicago conspiracy trial reconciled a lot of those problems later, 2 years later. But in the beginning, there was a certain irritability and a lack of tolerance, let's say, on both sides.
You were at the levitation of the Pentagon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was. Yeah.
Paint a picture of Abby at that event for us. What are we seeing? What is he doing during that time? What kind of drugs is he on?
Well, at least marijuana, for sure. I don't think he would have been on LSD because he also planned to march on the Pentagon, and he did. He did it. So he's probably, like most of us, kind of stoned on grass. And colorfully dressed and chanting. I remember they did the exorcism. There were chants, and I can remember Abby like on a stage chanting. That's my image of him from the exorcism. The chanting, and Ed Sanders and Julie Kopelberg and the Fugs were there, and I think he was kind of working with them. Recollection. And Abby, like some of the others who were involved in the exorcism and the levitation, people who were into mysticism and so on, were actually acting like they were going to maybe levitate the Pentagon. See? Now Abby knew they weren't actually going to levitate the Pentagon. So what he brought to it was a sense of the kibitzing of the event. The event had actually attracted some real mystics who were going to try to do it. So Abby thought that was great, let him try. And he always had a joke. He said, well, we were negotiating with the Defense Department to do this demonstration, and when we said we were going to levitate the building, they asked us how high, and said 200 feet, but then we negotiated, we compromised for 50 feet. No, that was Abby. But he had this kibbutzer sense. So Abby never took it seriously. He had the sense of play, that this was a form of play that was making fun of the Pentagon. And that's what he brought to the event, humor. So.
What was it like when he would get up and speak? before people? What were the kinds of things that you remember him saying? What was his effect on the crowd?
Well, Abby and Jerry became better speakers as time went by. They became more powerful speakers. Abby got people laughing. That I do remember even then. When Abby would speak, you know you were going to be entertained. You had fun. Abby was a fun guy. And no matter what, he always had the jokes. Very quick sense of humor. I mean, it was a brilliant speed of mind. Like the rebuttal remark about, you won't let us in because we're Jewish. So yeah, Abby made people laugh. That's what I remember about the early Abby. It's kind of like a stand-up comic with a political purpose and a brilliant kibitzer.
What were his, when he would see that there were cops nearby and there were protesters nearby, would he get in the middle of it and try to incite or encourage the protesters?
Sometimes you get right in the middle of it, get busted, later I saw Abby with his nose broken open, got roughed up. Well, we all do. At this point, it was a little less confrontational. But I know that living on the Lower East Side, he had this odd relationship with the cop who was in charge of the 9th Precinct. And he sometimes was on friendly terms with him, and sometimes not. And sometimes he'd go down to the police station and get himself arrested for disturbing the peace or destroying property. And then other times he was friendly with them. So Abby even then could have his more aggressive side, but the emphasis was on humor, predominant. The other side hadn't really developed all that much. Basically, Abby brought fun to politics and creativity, satire, theater.
What was his relationship with hippies? Because when he formed the hippies, it was almost sort of a reaction to hippies.
Well, Abby wasn't really a hippie. I think his interest in hippies was that he saw them as people who were rebelling against the system but were kind of apolitical. And he thought that he could, if he developed the right style of politics, draw them into politics. And so that's why it was yippie and not hippie. But yippie aimed primarily at winning hippies over to politics, at creating a politics that they would find interesting. I mean, some of these, union guys who were complaining about the peace and the mobilizers, they were nice guys. They have quite a life, accomplishment, But I didn't think many hippies would follow, retail workers' union leaders, and Abby did. And so he was trying to develop, and we all were, but Abby somewhat having the edge, at least on the East Coast, on developing tactics and styles of protest that would bring the hippies in as activists.
Are you a hippie? Were you a hippie?
Yeah, I was very attracted to yippie.
What is yippie, and when you formed it, what was Abby's role and your role and Jerry's role?
Well, we used to have a joke. We used to say, a yippie is a hippie who's been hit over the head by a cop. And indeed, there was some truth to that. Radicalized by a police stick. I was something in the Bay Area, living in the Bay Area. I really got attracted to hippie culture. But I was also a radical, a socialist, a secularist. And so I tried to mix. Sort of like I could be a yippie one day, and then a peacenik the next day, and then maybe a socialist on the next day. And I felt like I could have different identities in different contexts. But when it came to Chicago and the demonstrations, I was with the yippies. So I was probably more a yippie than anything else. But I wasn't just a yippie. I was also a white supporter of the Black Panther Party on the West Coast. I tried to mix identities.
What about Abby and Jerry at this point?
Well, Jerry at this point was still something of a mixer because he was working for the Moe, the staffer, and Abby, I would say, was less so. Abby was getting into more. This was his identity, full time. And eventually also Jerry got that way. I think after the Pentagon demonstration, Jerry also became that way. But I went back, living on the West Coast, so I had another identity, Berkeley Radical, which I also really liked. So I had a number of identities, but in New York I was a yippie, mostly.
In New York, with the Yippie Party, when it was formed, what were some of the goals? And again, what was Abby's role in? Was he trying to bring seriously trying to bring people under a Yippie Party and to run for office?
Well, at times they did get serious about actually making a party of it. Like there was a term, Youth International Party, and they would actually have meetings and organize real events, and then they'd lose interest in doing that, and then it would revive again. So there were periodic attempts to actually create a Youth International Party, and they'd be promising, but then they'd kind of fall through. People would lose interest in it. And then later it might get revived again. Like I remember during the conspiracy trial, there was some efforts made to revive an actual political party. But that never really, you can say that there was seriousness about it, but that didn't catch on.
What were they for and what were they against?
Well, let's see. Anti-war, definitely anti-war. Anti-commercialization, very much anti-consumerism. That was a big thing. Early stages of protect the environment, but mild, very mild. Kind of pre-women's liberation, pro-sex, pro-drugs. The idea of living for free, a free society, getting what you need for free. That was definitely part of the hippie philosophy. Everything should be free. Figure out some way to do that. Everything should be free. And the music, make the music
Everything's
available, non-commercialized. Yeah.
Did you ever meet did ever like a kid walk up to you and say, you know, I want to be a Yippie? What was that like? When I mean, it seems like it was so.
It happened all the time. Still happens. I get emails today from young kids. It still happens. It's not over. There's usually something you can tell them. Well, why don't you go here and work on this demonstration, or go to the free store and help out there, or, well, we're serving fish tonight to the community. Why don't you show up and help us clean some fish? Or, you know, we're going to throw money at the stock exchange. Why don't you come up on the balcony with us? I mean, there's usually, in those days especially, there were so many things going on that, you know, later on the Bay Area, well, why don't you just go work in People's Park, you know, in the lake system. There was always something. So it happened a lot. People wanted to be yippies, young people, and you could tell them ways that they could be yippies.
And if you were a Yippie, what would you do differently than another person who wasn't?
Well, you were definitely you were wilder and more theatrical in your style of politics than the straight leftist, let's say the regular traditional leftist. But on the other hand, you weren't like apolitical or even anti-political hippies who say, "Oh, man, you know, you're just going to bring on the heat if you do," you know. So you were sort of like between. You found yourself between two worlds.
You weren't peacenik, so to speak. You were really confrontational, right?
More, yeah. Well, yeah, we weren't pacifist. Well, no, actually, to be fair about it, as Yippie developed, there was a pacifist wing and a non-pacifist wing. But even the pacifist wing was like confrontational pacifist, but non-violent.
What about Abby? Where was he in?
Well, I think initially he was more on the pacifist side, but not really. His temperament was much more combative than that, and I think he dropped out after a while. You know.
What was it like when he would walk down the street and just like an average guy would kind of see him? Was he the kind of person that
Well, it depends on what period you're talking about. In the Lower East Side, this period, 67 or so, certainly walking around St. Mark's Place with Abby was an experience, because all kinds of young people came up to him to tell him something or ask him something or make a suggestion. You just couldn't walk down the street. Later, when Abby became a household name, say, and that would have been in probably during the conspiracy trials, 69, 70, well then going around with him he was not an ordinary guy, he was a celebrity. They went in restaurants, people recognized him, flight attendants recognized him, cops recognized him. It was hard. I mean, he liked it. It was like kind of being a movie star, but it was also annoying, because there were times when he wanted a more, to be like a more ordinary person, and he wasn't. He was famous.
What about cops? You said that. I mean, when did he start calling cops pigs? What was their reaction when they were called upon?
Well, it was the Black Panther Party, probably in 67, 68, who started calling police pigs. Actually, Huey Newton, the co-founder of the party, began that. And generally speaking, I'd say the cops didn't like it.
To
put it mildly, they didn't like it. The radical movement, yippie and otherwise, took the word of pig and used it in a more universal sense, in that we would, like the Panthers, we still refer to the cops as the pigs. But we tend to call everybody, like Nixon, you know, the pig system, the pig empire. We use the term a little more universally than the Panthers did, and then of course when the women's liberation movement came along, it turned sexist pig. Okay, so it got universalized. Started just cops, and then became much broader. Naturally, nobody enjoyed being called a pig. You didn't call a person a pig because you wanted to please them. Say, well, I'll get on this guy's good side, call him a pig. So it was the use of the word pig. It's a measure of the combativeness and the division in the society. That in '65, probably none of us would have used the word. We would have thought it was too extreme, too polarized. But by the late '60s, we're all using it. And just also like in the early '60s, everyone was flashing the V sign. In the later '60s, the fist movement. There was a growing polarization in the society. A lot of it was because the war didn't end. You know, we had all these big demonstrations, and the war was obviously a disaster. Like today, of lawsuits.
Right.
Yeah. Today, everybody sues.
So did it happen frequently after that? That when you were arrested, you could expect that you'd get roughed up at some point, or?
More often than not, I wasn't. But for some reason, the night that this happened, this was just. And then, of course,
did you say something that set it off, or did you?
They didn't like the way I was acting in the
like
street, and so they were taking revenge. It was an act of revenge. Yeah. When the press wasn't around, you know, it was private rule thing. They didn't like what I was doing out in the street. They didn't like what any of us were doing out in the street, and they took it out on me. Basically, that was it. That didn't always happen. Probably more than not, it didn't. But it happened. This happened. And just like in Chicago, I got hit in the back, probably with a blackjack from a cop. And there wasn't really a provocation, actually, in that case, none at all.
They closed in, and it's
well, we were watching there was this group, the MC5, which was a very Midwest-based rock group in those days, very popular. And they were performing in Lincoln Park. They were the only rock group to show up. Everyone else canceled. So they were there. And basically I was just listening to them play, and I got cracked over the back of the head.
They knew you, though. They must have been following you, or
They followed me, yes. All the people who were considered key activists had people following them, cops. And they didn't disguise it. They didn't hide it. It was very open. They just followed you. Yeah. You could talk to them.
And when did that start with you, and maybe you can tell about Abby a little bit, the cops, the FBI following you?
Well, in Chicago, it started like as soon as we arrived there. It's hard to say. I believe the FBI in general started getting interested. The File show in the New Left in 1968. And Abby certainly came under surveillance in and after Chicago, and of course the investigation that led to his being indicted, the conspiracy defense. So I guess it started really close in the late 60s.
So Chicago was the goal. I mean, there were all these other things going on in '67 and '68, but it seemed like everything was pointing to Chicago. What was Abby hoping to accomplish in Chicago?
Well, initially, it changed. See, initially, he was trying to use Chicago to have, he knew there'd be political marches, protests, anti-war marches. He wanted to add a countercultural event called the Festival of Life to the regular political events. It wasn't as a substitute, and it wasn't competitive. It was just an addition. And you'd have musicians, and you'd have artists, and you'd have all kinds of things being taught. The whole new counterculture, from people who give massages to drummers, or people who teach self-defense, meditation. The whole new counterculture. He had this sense of a festival of life to show it off. Now, when Mayor Daley showed up, no willingness to grant permits for anything, and he started making some very threatening statements, all kinds of people in the counterculture said, no man, Chicago's too heavy, we're not going to go. So rock bands dropped out, or the record companies got them to drop out. You hear all kinds of stories of how it happened, how maybe the role FBI played behind the scenes. In any case, you start having "Don't go to Chicago" articles in the Rolling Stone newspaper. And so eventually, the Festival of Life pretty much falls apart. So in the end, the reason Abbey went to Chicago was to uphold his right to do it. That there was this feeling in general, we all had it, that if we didn't go to Chicago, there would be like a terrible victory for these guys, for Hoover and Daley, LBJ, all the CIA, the cop on the beat. It would be just a victory for them that they scared us out of going to Chicago. And we couldn't let that happen. Even if we didn't have much of a Festival of Life left, just the MC5 or something, at least we would show up. They wouldn't frighten us out of it. So that's in the end, that's the reason Abbey went to Chicago.
Tell me about the pig and the debate over the pig.
Pegasus, yeah. Well, that was interesting, going back to our earlier talk about everybody, sort of Panthers calling cops pigs, and then everything getting called pig. Of course, the yippies added their humorous note to it by actually saying, well, we're going to run a pig for president, Pegasus, and we'll get a real pig. So that was almost sort of taking this harsh concept of using the word pig and maybe putting a humorous, joking edge to it. Now, as I remember it, Abbey somehow acquired a pig. And it was a sort of a small pig, kind of cute. And others of us, Jerry and others, thought it was too small and that it theatrically didn't work. We said they could get a big, ugly pig. So there was actually sort of like, this was like a political debate in Yippee over how big and ugly the pig should be. So what we decided was a compromise. We would have 2 pigs. You know, the joke was, well, the system, you know, the Democrats have more than 1 pig, the Republicans have more than 1 pig, and we can have more than 1 pig. So Jerry and I and Phil Oakes and Judy and a bunch of us went out to a farm in Illinois or Ohio, somewhere in the Midwest, and bought a pig. And it was hilarious because actually, as boys from the city, we had never seen real pigs before. You know, cartoons, Porky Pig, you know. So, and then the farmer had a little fun with us, and he wouldn't. We got a truck, see, and he wouldn't put the pig in the truck. He insisted that we pick the pig out and put the pig in the truck. Well, that took hours of rolling around in the mud. It was actually a hilarious. And then we started. I mean, I remember our laughter was incredible. It was sort of a release, I guess, from all the tension of Chicago and what was going to happen. That Abby and everyone just laughed. I mean, crazed, deep laughter. You know, trying to grab a pig and pig getting away, falling down. Eventually, we got Pegasus into the truck.
Were people horrified when you were walking down the street with this pig? What was the press reaction or the cops' reaction when you're?
Well, when we did it, we brought the pig where we were going to have a press conference and introduce our candidate. And we brought the pig to Civic Center in a truck, the same truck, in Civic Center in Chicago. And there's a Picasso statue there. And then we take the pig out of the truck, and I think people are not so much horrified as amazed to see this group of what appear to be hippies with a pig. And the press was there, and we started, for some reason, we started seeing the Star-Spangled Banner. And the cops came pouring out of nowhere and arrested us and the pig. And threw us.
They arrested the pig.
Yeah, they threw us and the pig into the paddy wagon, same paddy wagon. And they didn't keep us together in a jail cell. They took the pig someplace else, but yeah, they put us all in the jail cell.
Just for having the pig and nominating it for president, or?
They had some very odd, not used in 100 years, 19th century law about how it was a crime to bring livestock into the center of Chicago without permission.
So that's the first night you spent there.
In Chicago? Yeah.
That was the first night. When on Sunday night, you're at the festival, and it turns ugly. Describe that to me.
You mean when I got hit? Well, the MC5 was playing, and it seemed like it was just going to be, one of these, kick out the jams, rock sessions. Nothing special, but a very talented group. And then for some reason, stuff started getting thrown, rocks and things, from the back of the crowd. And I also have a recollection that the police disconnected the power that was sort of the generator that was providing the music. And then there was shoving, I remember, but you couldn't figure out exactly why any of it was happening. It was like, what's going on here, And then all of a sudden, I feel a thing on the back of my head. Now, initially, I thought that I had been hit by one of those rocks. So I'm bleeding, and I remember Abby is like practically the first person over there, and his face is really white, and he's very shaky and emotional about it. And he gets me over to some sort of medic, doctor or whatever who was there, one of our people. And they says, well, he's got to get this sewed up. And so they take me to a hospital and they get it sewed up. I don't remember if Abby came along or not, but he arranged it. Now, in the hospital, the doctors told me that the cut in the back of the head was too straight for it to have been a rock, and that it seemed like it was like something like they opined, like a blackjack, straight wound. So it seemed like the undercover cop, probably not dressed as a policeman, used the rock throwing, whoever was throwing the rocks, and I have no idea, as a cover to hitting me over the head with a blackjack.
Did you return to the demonstration after that?
No, I was bleeding too much.
But I mean the next day.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Well, the next day we had actually a press conference, and I was one of the people who spoke at the press conference.
And at that point, did you know that this thing was going to start to spin out of control, or did you figure that this was just an isolated incident?
No, we thought it was very dangerous. I mean, we knew when we decided to go to Chicago anyway that it was a very dangerous situation. Now, naturally, an event like that would confirm your fears, but we never. I mean, there were times, I suppose, you always hope that at the last minute, the warden will give you good news. And so we were hoping that Daley would yield and grant some permits, and there wouldn't be a confrontation. So there was a sort of a never say die optimism. But we knew we knew that it was a very dangerous situation we were in.
Can you sort of paint a picture of Abby in the midst of those 3 days, 4 days?
Well, there are changing images. The Abby who really helped me after I got hit over the head was one Abby. The Abby who was in some sort of performance thing with the cops who were following him around, and how he was kibitzing with them, was another Abby. Abby running in the street from tear gas was another Abby. Abby in this never-ending argument with Jerry was another Abby. And so there were different Abbeys. There wasn't just one Abby, the comedian, the joker. There were a lot. Abby wrote a document. Jerry at one point said, well, you don't stand for it. You just do these things, but you don't stand for something. So then Abby goes home and he writes this program for the Youth International Party. He gives it out in the park. And you probably get that. You get a copy of that. And that came about because of this conflict.
Yeah, tell me about because Jerry wanted to Jerry put out something very critical of Abby and what's going on?
He threatened to put it out. He wrote it, and he read it at a private meeting. I remember Paul Krasner was there, and Anita, Jerry, Nancy Kershan, Judy Claver, and myself. I don't know if anyone else, I don't remember. And he had this statement, and he read it. It was very hostile, really nasty.
Well, it's very hostile.
Yeah, hostile and nasty statement about Abby and how Abby was just on a big ego trip and he was apolitical and so forth. Jerry never actually distributed that statement. I think he was just venting. And Abby responded by then distributing a political statement which spelled out what you have to say was the humanistic and cultural, countercultural side of his politics. But still, I mean, it was...
was Jerry right?
About Abby in what sense?
That Abby was just basically kind of showboating and was not really interested in politics. It was more about the theatrical side.
Well, but then he might get that way sometimes. But then when someone called him on it, he would say that's not true. I really do believe in politics and ideas, and then I'll make an expression of it. So I would say, like Abby was complex, and he had his egotistical, egomaniac side, his desire ultimately to become famous. He started using his name and all that, and publicizing himself. But he was also still idealistic radical. Someone who did really want to change the world. So I think people are not one thing or another. A lot of times they're mixed. They're mixtures, and Abby was a mixture. So was Jerry.
Did Abby have street credibility in Chicago? Were people following him, listening to him, doing what he was asking them to do? Or?
Some. My general impression is that the people who were indicted for Chicago and the co-conspirators had only a minor effect on what would happen in Chicago. In truth, aside from the Pegasus event, which we did organize and pull off, and it got a lot of great publicity, basically it was like a wind blowing over Chicago. I think Daley and the out-of-control rioting cops certainly had more influence on what happened in Chicago than Abby Hoffman or any radical. We were really overwhelmed. This recent 500,000 protest march at the Republican convention in New York, 500,000 people. Do you know only maybe 10,000 people came to Chicago? It was a very small demonstration. People had really been intimidated. And the demonstration had lost, when the rock stars started saying they were going to stay away, there was a lot of negative publicity. We didn't have a large crowd. So it was easy for us to be overwhelmed by forces and then just hope. Our goal was to stay there till the end of the convention, not to get broken and not to be forced out of town. That's what we were about.
When the cops came in and they were swinging and it just got completely out of control.
Well, this was the first time I had seen what I would call a police riot. I mean, there were say, the cops in the elevator in Berkeley, you could say that was a little mini police riot, I guess. Totally like illegal throughout all the rule books and law books. But this was the first time I had seen writ large a police riot. And it was really out of control. I mean, the cops would do. I actually saw some cops pull cops off of people. There were some cops who actually tried to control the cops. There were scenes like in Lincoln Park of people, someone on the ground getting beaten up, and other cops trying to control cops. Not that I don't want to exaggerate that. It didn't happen too much, but I did see it.
Was there a conspiracy? Ultimately they were all put on trial for conspiracy. What's your take on? Did Abby Hoffman's brother, other people said no, they did come to Chicago to incite a riot. They did want to incite a riot. Did you, when you planned to come to Chicago, there must have been something inside of you that said, well, we do want a little action here. We want some kind of response from the cops, so that will justify our cause.
That's not. It's complicated. Again, people have diverse motives, and it's not what you think that is the crime. Ultimately, no one can know what any human being thinks. I don't know what was in Abby's mind. I mean, probably he was thinking of a riot. He was probably thinking of sex. He was probably thinking of where can I get a good hamburger. I mean, human beings think lots of things at the same time. You get judged by what you do, not by what you think. And the law presumes what you think from what you do. Not what your brother knows. Abby, I know Abby. No. The law presumes what you think from what you do. What we did was conducted negotiations with the mayor's office, trying to get permits. And if the mayor's office had granted those permits, it's absolutely true, there would not have been riots. We did nothing to provoke a police riot. The police riot was so out of what was defensible as law enforcement. And you could say, well, was there some quirky, eccentric side in Abby that maybe was glad it happened? Maybe. But that has nothing to do with the law. The law, Abby and all of them should have been fully acquitted in Chicago, not half acquitted. Because, in fact, they came to Chicago, they made reasonable demands, they were negotiating with the city. If the city had agreed to their demands, they would have, reasonable demands, there would have been no violence and no police riot. So, my feeling is that you can't know what someone was thinking. You can only look at what they did.
But the police said that you all conspired.
No, that's absolutely not true. First of all, Bobby Seale, let's take him as an extreme case. He's one of the conspirators. He only met, aside from Jerry, he met all the other defendants after they were indicted. How could he have been conspiring with them? Abby and Jerry, the whole period of Chicago, were fighting and arguing. Like Abby said at the trial, we couldn't even agree on lunch. How could they have been conspiring? Rennie and Tom and Dave, there was some modest amount of conversation, but they were working on their own projects, and we weren't working with them. So no, there was no conspiracy. I mean, it really wasn't. People didn't even know each other. I only became friends with Tom, for instance, after Chicago. We met in Chicago, kind of got along, and then he came out to Berkeley and said, let's live together. But I didn't know him before Chicago, so how could I have conspired with him?
So after this, is this when Abby, is this kind of the high point of his political career?
Well, the trial is, in terms of him becoming famous. The trial went on, what, 6 months, something like that, seems like it. 1969, 1970. Abbey's name was in the paper. I mean, this is an exaggeration, but it seemed like daily. Became a household name.
What was his, what did he tell you about that time? Would you remember him, like, looking at the trial, what was he trying to accomplish through this trial?
Well, there was, as usual, this time, though, he and Jerry got along. But there were disagreements with Tom Hayden and some of the other defendants. Dave Dellinger was kind of in the middle. Everybody respected Dave Dellinger. Bobby Seale, who was not out on bail because he also was facing a murder charge in Connecticut, which he subsequently beat, was only kind of not able some ways to be fully involved in the planning of things. And of course he had his own point of view in this situation. But there was conflict between Tom and Abby and Jerry especially. And it had to do with what the behavior of the defendant should be at the trial. Tom's view was that should play it straight, present a strong case, go for an acquittal. The Yippee view was, we can't get an acquittal here, it's impossible. And we have a great opportunity here for months to use the courtroom as a stage for our politics. And then Tom said, no, our politics should be out in the street, not in the courtroom. So there was that was sort of a debate. And Abbey was definitely on the side of we should do theater in the courtroom. Like he dressed up like a judge and then took off the judge's robes and he had a police uniform on underneath. There was the theater. Then, of course, there was also the issue of Bobby Seale getting chained and gagged for not being able, because he wanted to represent himself, and then he was chained and gagged, and that's what led to the most disruptive behavior in the courtroom, both the cops and the federal marshals and the defendants. Although Bobby always said, and it's probably true, that the most aggressive defending Bobby was Dave Dellinger, who was a big guy, pacifist, but he did some good shoving.
I mean, in a way, if it was an effective strategy to corral the leadership and put them on trial.
Well, in New York, we call it a balance ticket. You used to say, well, you need an Italian, an Irishman, and a Jew. That's your ticket in New York. And their ticket here was, you have some yippies, you have some pacifists, you have some Panthers, you have new lefties like Hayden. You get a mix, see, SDS. I think ultimately, though, the trial was a disaster for the government. Because, remember back, Chicago, only 10,000 people showed up. If they had been sensible and granted permits, it would have been a very small, peaceful demonstration, and we wouldn't be sitting here talking about it. It just wouldn't be forgotten. Too small to be remembered. They were crazy, and they held back on permits. Secondly, in the Chicago trial, they made such famous larger-than-life personalities out of at least some of the defendants. That when the verdict came in, and it was a mixed verdict, but one of the counts was guilty, like, I don't know, maybe 100,000 people around the country rioted. Now, no, that was, we only got 10,000 in Chicago. So the movement became much larger and better known and influential as a result of the trial. Not as a result of Chicago, but as a result of the trial in Chicago. That really built everything. And it was a totally stupid move on their part. And had the Democrats won the election, there wouldn't have been that indictment. Johnson was holding back on it. His attorney general was holding back on it. And if the Democrats got in all probability, that indictment wouldn't have taken place. And that would have been the end of it. So, but the system was just out of control. You know, people think of how, like, we were out of control. They had Chicago made. They just all had to do a few permits for people to sleep in the park. They didn't need to have the indictments. At the end of it, they turned all these people into national heroes, at least among a lot of young people, and very influential, very powerful people. After the trial, Abby and Jerry were on bail, and Abby went all around the country speaking and drawing tremendous crowds, unprecedented crowds. That's when he became a really good speaker and a really good public performer, because he was starting to then mix entertainment and theater with analysis. Abby was a very intelligent fellow, and more a straighter form of politics. He's mixing it now. He's not just being the guy who makes you laugh. He makes you laugh, plenty, but he also gets you angry, gets you stimulated about ideas, gets you thinking, not just laughing, and gets you feeling. And this is like somewhat of an evolution for him. And of course, he's world famous. And they made him world famous. They gave him this incredible audience then for him.
How did he manage?
Well, I think initially he did pretty well with it. I still found him to be a regular guy. I still enjoyed hanging out with Abby. I didn't see all that like great change in him. I think later it started getting complicated, how to handle it and so forth. But I think initially his movement roots. Remember, Abby had been a SNCC activist in the South. That's how he broke into this. I think his movement roots gave him some capacity to handle it initially. And the government gave him that platform. It's amazing. They wouldn't give us any kind of platform in Chicago. They wouldn't even let the MC5 have a rock concert. But they gave Abby an international stage to play on. You talk about that saying the Greeks had, whom the gods would destroy, they first make mad. That's the only way I could think of the government at that time, was going nuts.
So he's got this following.
Quite a following now, yeah.
And he and Jerry are almost like poster kids, even though they're not getting along.
Well, they got along in Chicago. They got along during the trial, and for some time after the trial,
And now, like, people like John Lennon are starting to speak them out.
Yeah. Right.
What was, again, Abby's this kid from Worcester, and all of a sudden now he's probably the most dangerous man in America, according to the government. or one of the more
One of the
dangerous.
most, yeah.
And he's hanging out with these radical sheep. What do you remember from that period? Was it?
Well, to some extent, he kept those worlds separate. I knew that he hung out with some Hollywood biggies and some rock music like Grace Slick, people like that. He didn't. He didn't. Candice Bergen and Bert Schneider, but he didn't mix those worlds with the movement world. It was kind of like separate. It was like his assets. I think he started thinking of them as he, Abby, had these assets, and that he could use these assets. He could get, say, Candace to come to a Yippie press conference, which he did, and he could do things like that, but they were his assets. Now, interestingly enough, John Lennon and Yoko were more inclined to Jerry. And so that then John and Yoko kind of became like a Jerry asset. So it started getting like, you'd have to say a little unnatural. A little, the fame, and especially the bonds with celebrities, I would say was distorting of movement values. We never learned how to incorporate the fact that, like, say during the conspiracy trial, Dustin Hoffman came to Chicago, want to hang out with the defendants. We never quite learned how to handle all that and to incorporate it into our values. I mean, we did sort of. I'm not saying, that we fell all over these people and got their autographs or anything like that, or that we let them dictate to us about our politics. No. But on the kind of, there was still something that led to divisions and hierarchy, which was very antithetical to New Left values, started developing when it was like, who was closest to these celebrities? Well, then they had their prestige, being closer to the celebrities. It's sort of like also in fundraising. Who knows the most rich people? Well, that's a very prestigious fundraiser. Well, Abby knew the celebrities.
After Miami, was it kind of all the Nixon was reelected,
Yeah.
the war was changing, bombing campaign was different, was in a way, and just before he gets busted, was it over for Abby? What was the...
Well, I used to see, after Chicago, after Miami Beach, and I'd spent a lot of time with Abby during Miami Beach, and he was talking to me about how he wanted to have changes in his lifestyle. I had a sense that he and Anita were having difficulties. And it's the first time I'd ever gotten that sense, just from conversations. And that he wanted, he was also thinking of like, well, we're supporting McGovern. I think he was also thinking of getting more into the system. I couldn't quite put it together what he was about. He kept talking about how he wanted new, not just doing all the same old boring things, but he wanted to get involved in new lifestyles, just not get stuck in the old. So he was talking about stuff. Yeah. Except every community, 1/3 of the vote. I got something like 65,000 votes. Carried the city of Berkeley.
Wow.
Yeah.
You have been the new sheriff in town.
Well, if Berkeley elected its own sheriff, I sure would have been. Yeah, I won by 10,000 votes in Berkeley. Yeah. Sheriff Yiffy. And my slogan also is People's Pick, Stu Albert, People's Pick. So, no, I did run for office. I actually did.
Did you think that Abby would ever, Abby would ever run for office at this point when you're talking 72, or is he you're almost describing what Jerry Rubin ultimately went towards, which is figuring out a way to, capitalize, or maybe that's the word I'm searching for.
Well, I think Abby was thinking of maybe he could run for Congress or something. And that was part of what emphasized him to want to endorse McGovern.
Getting more legitimate.
Yeah, getting more in the system. And he was thinking maybe he'd get elected to Congress or something.
And did that blow your mind at the time, or?
It seemed unrealistic, given. Now it's true that, Bobby Rush, former Chicago Black Panther, has now been in Congress forever. So it's not impossible, but I somehow couldn't picture Abby. Now that I know, I have some friends who are in Congress, and I know what their lives are like. I couldn't picture it. It would be just so alien to who he is to even have that job.
What was the? I know. Okay. And this next question would cover a lot of territory, but just give me a sense of Abby and sex and drugs and rock and roll and that whole lifestyle.
Well, he definitely believed in sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And he did a lot of sex, a lot of drugs, and a lot of rock and roll. And so did a lot of us. It was the kind of ritualistic pace of our community. So at times we thought that there was something inherently progressive and transformative about this type of behavior, and at other times we just thought it was fun. But when we're saying drugs, we're talking about marijuana, hashish, various psychedelic drugs, certainly like LSD, psilocybin, peyote. We're not talking about smack, heroin, and at this stage, not even cocaine. We're talking about, we used to say there were life drugs and death drugs. And we were opposed to the death drugs and supported the life drugs. So that was, I guess, our way of negotiating the situation.
Many people from that era also experimented with LSD. How far did Abby go with LSD, and how much do you feel like it might have clouded in any way? Did he take too much LSD to the point where it really affected his judgment about that?
I never had that sense about Abby. Something started affecting his judgment, but I never had a sense that it was too much LSD or pot. No. I don't think that's the culprit.
What is the culprit if we're heading down that road?
Well, it seems like, yeah. The American celebrity probably the culprit. That it's a very harsh game. What is it? Scott Fitzgerald called it the bitch goddess. It's a tough place to be after a while, and there's always the fear of losing your faith. See, when you first get it, It's like it's given to you for free. All of a sudden you're famous. You're not even working for it. I mean, the government made Abbey famous. He didn't work to be famous. The trial made him famous. But then you think, well, you start thinking, if it was given to me, it can be taken away from me. That leads to all kinds of insecurity, and that can, all of that, the fame and the fear of losing it, but also the hatred of its demands, but then you can't live without it. I think that kind of probably could screw up your judgments. And if I were looking for some place to sort of see what undermined Abbey, I would look to the corruptions of fame and not to drugs, not to the effect of drugs on him.
Were people, how did he respond when people, did you ever say to him, you're all about the fame anymore, all you care about is the TV cameras? Or did anyone ever, were you ever around him when people said those kinds of things?
I was around him when yeah, some. He definitely was very, very defensive. Because, of course, he didn't want to be thought of that way, and because it wasn't what he believed in. So he was caught up in a very complicated situation. Also, Abbey always, at least for some time, held on to his politics, basically. And so you can never say, oh, Abbey has become a right-winger, or Abbey has politically sold out. He always, no matter how weird it got, he did always hold on to his values, his political values. At least he articulated them, he stated them. And that always softened, like, my critical feelings about him.
I want to get to the coke bust.
Yeah.
His brother, the first question I asked him, I said, how would you in general describe Abbey? He said he's a hustler.
Abbey was a hustler, yeah. All organizers.
Sorry, say that again.
Abbey was a hustler, but all organizers are hustlers. Well, my wife, she's a fundraiser for Planned Parenthood, so she makes a living. Well, there's hustling involved in that. There's all kinds of professions where hustling is part of it. Abbey, yeah, he was a hustler. How can you be a good organizer and not be out there hustling?
How about when it came to cocaine?
Well, in
Hold on one second.
oh, all right.
Hold on one second.
In 1970 or so, in the early 70s, cocaine use in among radicals, cultural rebels, political lefties started expanding. People didn't think of coke as being all that harmful or addictive.
It's like one of those good drugs. They're not a
Life.
drug.
It kind of got in. Part of the problem was that all our lives, everyone was telling us pot's addictive, hashish is addictive, all these sort of, and they weren't. So when people said, well, coke is addictive, I said, well, I know your game. You said that to me before. And so coke kind of got popular. Not popular like pot was popular, but because it was more expensive. But it was around. And I know that I and a lot of my friends experimented, as they say, with like I'm big into like, I was in a science class, I was experimenting with coke, but I was experimenting with coke, and
We didn't become addicted. I don't know of any of my friends who became, addicted. And it lasted through, I'd say, on and off through the 80s. Some point in the 80s, everybody realized coke was a very dangerous drug. And its use among my friends fell dramatically. But what I'm saying is, selling coke, when Abby was accused of doing it, wasn't what it would seem like today. At least not in our crowd. I mean, we all have friends who made a little extra money by dealing pot. Now I didn't ever do that, but I had friends who, were always working some kind of deal. So, and you like buying stuff from your friends because you felt safer. You weren't being set up. So it in terms of our culture, the idea of someone who was a friend of ours dealing a little, even coke, because we did it, it wouldn't seem to be so, off the wall. Now, the Abbey bust obviously went beyond him dealing a little coke to friends. I think that there was he certainly showed some real distorted judgment in getting involved in a larger coke dealing situation. I don't know why he did it. I mean, he said, "Well, I was writing a book about it," and I have no doubt he would have someday. And then he'd say, "Well, if I made the money, I'd have given it to the movement anyway." And I have no doubt that a significant part of it would have gone to the movement. But that doesn't explain the whole thing. There was some real, I mean, here's a guy who is a political leader. He's known around the world. And he gets busted on a coke charge. And it's not just a little bit of coke for a few friends. That you got to say that was bad judgment. Something was going wrong with the guy. Now there's a celebrity thing, and then Abby was developing some forms of, I guess, mental illness. Although I didn't know it at the time, but apparently he was, manic depressive, and there was bipolar personality. I mean, later he talked to me about this stuff, but at the time I didn't especially notice. I mean, Abby was always a little manic, that was his energy, and then there were times when he'd get depressed and get inactive. So there was always those elements, but they were never really out of hand.
So when he decides to go underground, did he call you? What was the first time you heard from him after he decides to jump bail and go underground?
Phone calls.
What were they?
Well, I wanted to see him. And so we worked out. You do this thing, you set up this thing with payphones. Could be at a payphone at a certain hour, and it would ring, and you'd have Abby on the other end of the line. "Hey, Stu, how you doing?" Something like that. "Why don't you come up here? I'm up here in Montreal. Why don't you come up here? We can hang out." So, okay. So,
did you really think nothing of it, or did you?
Nothing of it. No. I mean, I trusted that he would, when I got off the train, look me over, make sure I wasn't being followed. That he would do a little security check on me. Take that for granted. And he did. And we set up a little thing of, well, you just keep walking. If I approach you, it's cool. If I don't, well, you will follow. And it was fine. So I did that a number of times. He came down, visited us in the Catskills. Yeah.
Were you Like, was he paranoid? Were you paranoid about this being followed, or like, waiting at any minute for?
Not in the Canadian business, but when he came down, there was some kind of psychological deterioration that took place. That he was kind of out of control. He seemed, on the one hand, the opposite of paranoid. He would say, like, "Oh, they're not even following me anymore," and then, but then he would do things like he'd say, "Okay, let's go into this restaurant in Woodstock, and it's a friendly place," he said. And then he starts telling everybody in the place he's Abby Hoffman.
What was everyone's reaction?
Well, people said, well, the strangers said, "Cool, man, that's Abby. Hey, cool." But his friends, who were, you might say, sponsoring him, were freaked out to no end. But yeah, people, oh, Abby Hoffman, man, that's great. Went all over Woodstock that Abby Hoffman was in town.
So anyone really looking for him probably should have found him.
Well, they were looking for him. I know that, for instance, when I got my FBI file, they got a tip that Abby was at the cabin, and they went up there, burglarized my house. We sued them for this later, and they had a court settlement. And so they came up there looking for Abby. The FBI did. It was a totally false tip. But if they had gotten that tip a year later, it would have been true.
Didn't you get anyone knocking on your door saying, "Okay, Stu, from the FBI, where's your friend Abby?"
Not me. No, they wouldn't do that with me.
Oh, you did that.
They do that to younger, less experienced people. Me, they stay away from.
Did you get a sense from him that he was, in a way, like trying to almost turn himself in by doing, did he want to be caught? Did he?
Well, now you get into like what really is going on in people's minds. I think he wanted to be free. I think he wanted to lead a normal life. And so in a normal life, when you're a famous celebrity, you don't give a false name for yourself. You don't say, "I'm Barry Freed" or something like that. You say, "I'm Abby Hoffman." And I think he wanted to normalize his life. And I think sometimes he got a little delusional about how he could normalize his life. No, I didn't think he wanted to get caught. I think Abby would definitely not want to be in prison. But he didn't like the life of here being this world famous guy who can't give his name. It was driving him nuts. And so I think sometimes he'd snap and he'd tell people, "I'm Abby Hoffman."
Were you